think maybe I'm being a little bit over-ambitious with this podcast, but we'll see. And it might be quite a long one. I've called this a philosophy of the obvious because I believe, at least, that the steps that I've got here on this slide, and I apologise if you're looking on a portable device, a phone or something. The text is probably very small, but it's the best I could do on a single screen. Anyway, the aim of this podcast is to show you that you don't exist. Because actually only in non-existence is there freedom, obviously. And I will say that if you, I don't know, if you don't like being challenged on these kind of things, then best not to listen. Because, yeah, some people, in fact I know of one guy who eventually committed suicide because he just couldn't accept the kind of thing that is going to be explained here. I didn't know him directly, actually. I knew him indirectly, but even so. Anyway, philosophy of the obvious. I think these are kind of obvious steps. And I need to give a bit of background because the core reasoning here is around causality. Now, if you have a bit of a philosophical background, then you'll know about something called the principle of sufficient reason. If you don't, then I'll explain it briefly. The principle of sufficient reason basically says that there is a reason everything happens. The person who probably did most work in this area, to a large extent anyway, was Schopenhauer. And he published a work, in fact it was his doctoral thesis, I think, called the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. Yeah, quite a mouthful. But the principle of sufficient reason basically says that everything has a cause and the universe is sort of like a cause and effect matrix. Everything is a result of cause and effect processes. And there's a whole story there, which I haven't got time to go into, but science is obviously based on the solidity of the idea that every time you, I don't know, put so much fuel in a rocket, it will go a certain height up into the sky. Every time. There are no exceptions. Now, what Schopenhauer discovered was that there are four kinds of cause and effect, or the principle of sufficient reason. You know, sufficient reason being, this is sufficient reason that so-and-so would happen. The first one was just for inanimate objects, cause and effect. You cause something, so, you know, the rocket example, you cause it to go into the sky by putting so much fuel into it and igniting it, and hey presto, it goes up into the sky. That will happen every time. There's a cause and effect process going on there. It's a bit more refined than that, but that's the gist of it. And then also, there is cause and effect in logic. So, you know, what is the reason that a certain proposition is true? I'm not going to go into that, but, you know, that's the way our minds work. There is a cause and effect taking place in the way that we think logically. And then there's cause and effect in the realms of mathematics and geometry, in other words, things to do with space and time. And finally, there's cause and effect associated with the will. As far as Schopenhauer is concerned, we are manifestations of will or desire. And I've covered that in other podcasts, so I'm not going to go over it again. But I'll give you a very brief example. Say you're walking down the street and you see someone driving around in a very, very nice, brand new Porsche, a car. And this impresses you so much that for the next 5 years, you decide to take on a part-time job to earn enough money so you can buy one of these things. That's obviously stimulation of the will, a motive as Schopenhauer would call it, and then 6 years or 5 years of work to actually earn the money to go and buy this car. Not something I do personally, but people do that kind of thing. It might be something else. You see some person that you particularly desire, and for a year or two you try and court them and seduce them. So when it comes to this fourth kind of causality, the cause may be just some relatively insignificant event. You just see something you want. And then the effect is huge. For the next 4 or 5 years you totally orientate your life around trying to get this stuff or whatever. So, that's a bit of background on cause and effect. Cause and effect is basically how we see the world and how we understand it. It is right at the root of our perception of the world and our understanding of it. If you abandon cause and effect, then you effectively say that there are causeless effects, just things that pop out of nowhere or happen for no reason. We can't think about things like that. Try it. We actually can't think about things like that. So the first proposition here is that you are part of a universal cause and effect process. The whole damn universe is linked together in various ways. At a trivial level, the gravity generated by your body is affecting, albeit very, very, very insignificantly, the Andromeda Galaxy. You are linked to the Andromeda Galaxy via gravitation, just that you can't detect it. And multiple other ways. If you go out for a drive in your car today, you will change the traffic flow possibly around the world by your drive, because you'll get to a certain junction, you'll have to wait, or you make somebody else wait, then that other person gets a little bit later to the next junction and they cause somebody else to wait, and so on and so forth. And maybe somebody was going to go and get a flight somewhere, and they were late for the flight, and so on and so forth. So everything you do potentially has massive effects. So we live in this cause and effect process called the universe. Now the interesting thing is that to a large extent we are blind to causes. We are actually an effect. You didn't create yourself, you didn't create the universe, you are an effect of all these processes taking place. And as an effect, you are to a large extent cause blind. And again, I've covered this in other podcasts, but if you decide you want lasagna, then you may just say to yourself, oh, I want lasagna, this is what I want, this is my will. But actually, if you look at it, then maybe your mother would cook you lasagna if you'd been a good boy, and there are those associations going on in the background that you're not particularly aware of. We are cause blind, and so we take effects. I want lasagna, that is an effect, to be a cause. We say, oh, I've got free will, but actually everything we think and everything we desire is caused by other stuff, and we're largely blind to those things. So every thought, desire, emotion you have is caused by universal processes of which you are an inseparable part. Well, I've just given the example of you being linked to the Andromeda Galaxy via gravity, upsetting traffic flows around the world because you went out for a drive to the shop today. The whole thing is you can't really separate out, and in fact if you get into physics, then there's a thing called quantum entanglement, which means that one atomic particle can affect another atomic particle, even if it's at the other end of the universe, for the rest of eternity. And again, that's a shallow representation of that, but that's the kind of thing that's going on all the time. Everything's linked together. There's no woo-woo here, it just happens to be a fact that everything's linked together. So if everything is linked together, then proposition 4 is, in my opinion, fairly obvious. You have no self. You are an effect, the result of infinite causes that you have no measure of or no understanding of. So your organism is a causal dance with the rest of the universe. And what you do today is wholly caused by other stuff that is going on. You may not be aware of all of that, but that's the way it works. If you say you have free will, you are claiming causeless effects. You are saying that you stand outside of the laws of cause and effect that determine the behavior of the whole universe. So I don't think that's particularly likely. Well, I was rudely interrupted there by my barking little bastards, otherwise known as my dogs. Anyway, so back to this thing of self. If you are a wholly caused set of behaviors, then where exactly is this self? I mean, I haven't plucked all this out of thin air. If you want a good treatment of how there is no self, then you need to read Schopenhauer's Ethics Part 2. If you want a really, really good understanding of causality, then, as I've mentioned, you read Schopenhauer's fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, and so on. What a mouthful that one is. Anyway, so point 5, you are a slave to the universal cause and effect process. Spinoza puts this into other words. He says we are slaves of God or nature. And Schopenhauer says pretty much the same thing, and Kant says pretty much the same thing. In fact, most of the great thinkers say the same thing. And Einstein actually summarized the whole thing very nicely. He said, you can do what you want, but you cannot want what you want. Yeah, you'll probably need to think about that one. But in a sentence or two, Einstein, in his typical way, summarizes hundreds of years of philosophical debating. You can do what you want, but you cannot want what you want. And you cannot want what you want. It's a ridiculous notion. So you are a slave to the universal cause and effect process. Everything that you think is noble or really smart or really insightful or whatever it is, whatever vanity you have, is actually just a result of these processes taking place. And of course, you are a created thing, in whatever way you want to consider that. And so you have particular traits and particular biases and so on. So your response to the environment will be slightly different to everybody else's, but all the same, it's a response. So you are a slave to the universal cause and effect process. Everything you think, feel and do is a product of these processes. Everything without exception. I did warn you. I did warn you about this podcast. Many people find this very, very difficult to accept. Why do they find it difficult? Because their ego doesn't want to accept it. Their ego doesn't want to accept that actually it has control over absolutely nothing. Your ego cannot actually tell you what you are going to be thinking in a minute from now, whether you will be alive in 5 minutes from now, or whether you will be in an emotional rage 5 minutes from now. Because all of those things are determined by external circumstances over which you have no control. So, point 6. These processes will bring pleasures and suffering. The processes just take place the way they take place. You know, if a roof tile is loose on a roof and it's particularly windy and it gets blown off and it lands on your head, it wasn't personal. It's just a process taking place. In that case, pure cause and effect at a physical level. You get pleasure when your desires are fulfilled and pain otherwise. Simple as that. You're just a pleasure-pain machine to some extent, dependent on external circumstances. Point 7. Struggling against or objecting to these processes is just part of the process, or the processes. Because, you know, a lot of people who are interested in this kind of thing, you know, me included, think that there's something, you know, fairly smart about objecting to the way life is and to struggling against it in whatever way that they might think that they're struggling, but actually that those objections and struggles are no more or any less profound than somebody watching soaps on the TV all day. Watching soaps on the TV all day actually may not lead to very much satisfaction, but the point I'm trying to make is that if you are struggling or objecting to the way life is, or the way life unfolds, or the way life is for you, then you are clearly, that is caused, and you are just part of this cause and effect process. There's nothing in there that is profound. The idea of profundity is absurd, really. So, point 8. Total acceptance of our slavery is freedom. Yeah, I know it sounds like I'm just doing that to be smart, but I'm not. It's actually true, because what happens is once you really understand that there's this cause and effect nexus, this whole big machine chugging along in time and space, then you start to think maybe just outside of your own tiny little needs and desires. You know, if you want a good insight into that, then read Spinoza's theological and political treatise. Chapter 16. Brilliant stuff. Maybe I'll do a whole podcast on that. Anyway, once we start to identify with the whole, and again, this isn't some touchy-feely woo-woo stuff, it's just the result of thinking this stuff out. You are part of a cause and effect matrix. It's not a word I like, but it is really a matrix of cause and effect. But the whole thing, the thing as a whole, is by necessity unconditioned. Very hard to explain these things. You know, if you want to get a deep feel and understanding of this, then you have to study it for fucking years. 15 minutes or 20 minutes on a podcast isn't going to do it. Anyway, so total acceptance of our slavery is freedom, since we identify with the whole, which is itself unconditioned. And then 9. Total acceptance can only come through realizing we do not exist as separate units. You know, even at a physical level, you're breathing the air all the time. You ingest other creatures and make them part of yourself. You're taking in impressions all the time from the outside. The boundary between what you are and what you are not is actually fairly fluid. So, total acceptance can come only through realizing that you do not exist as a separate thing. There is no self. Once you realize that, then you get to what Emile Cioran clearly understood and realized, that nothing matters. How can anything matter when you're not in control of anything? So, he says, nothing matters, a major discovery if ever there was one. And actually this is from a document that somebody somebody gave me. It's, if I can read the title, it's Encounter with the Void by M.L. Swaron. Absolutely astonishing essay. And he goes on later in that very paragraph. He says, "There is no self. This we know." Well, most people don't know that. They hang on to the idea of a self because it's frightening to think that basically you're part of a huge, great fucking thing that just works the way it works, has no particular regard for you. And as Spinoza says, humanity is but a speck in the whole of the universe. And the universe has its own laws and cause and effect mechanisms which have no regard for humanity. I've said many times that a couple of billion years from now the sun will blow up and basically consume the earth, fry it. So the earth too has a limited lifetime. The whole thing is just one big evolving process, and we just happen to be around right here and now because of, well, whatever reason. As I say, we're cause blind to a large extent. So I hope someone at least understands that you get freedom and a real life through accepting your slavery and realizing that that implies very much that it is a separate individual thing. You do not exist. There is no self. And on that happy note, I'll finish.